Today I'm going to build a direct attached storage unit for my home NAS. I'm using a giant Lian Li case. It's extremely large. It's got on wheels, so I can't really put in any more drives in that thing efficiently. And I'd like to switch to rack mount, which I'll probably do around Christmas. I'll probably sell the case and switch over to a big rack mount system that I can vent the heat out of this small office room. But until then, I'm trying out some different techniques. I recently built a direct attached storage unit that I didn't film, but it was a Fractal Design Node 804 case, which is a really good case to use as DAS. But unfortunately, it's not perfect. They should have modified it to allow you to install additional hard drive mounts to cover up where the motherboard would go, since you don't need them in a direct attached storage situation. It'd be nice if they gave you at least the option to do that. I'm waiting on some spare parts. I'm going to probably modify it to do that, but in the meantime I thought I'd give another technique of building a DAS a try, which is buying a disk duplicator case. So I bought this one from Copy Stars, and they have several models. This is the 7-bay one, and they have all the way up to, I think, 13 bays, although that one's kind of pricey. It's almost $200, and it's obviously a lot taller. I wanted a relatively compact one. So disk duplicator cases are basically PC cases that don't have motherboard space, so they're designed from the ground up to just be a whole bunch of 5 1/4 inch drives. They almost always come with power supplies and nothing else. They're really just an empty case that holds power supplies and optical drives. This particular one is actually pretty decent. I mean, it's for $90, it's not amazing. It's pretty thin sheet metal, and the power supply is ancient. I mean, disk duplicator cases in general are ancient in design, but that's just kind of how they are. This particular one, I'm putting in these 3-bay storage converters that convert it to 5 3.5 inch drives, and I'll show it more in a minute. But I really like these ones because you can just put a straight 120 millimeter fan in, so obviously they'll take up 6 with 2 of them, and I'll have 1 spare that I can put anything in, so I can just put a regular hot swap bay or something in there and use that if I need more space. But I'm planning on just putting in these 2 things. I don't even have 10 drives to fill them up completely right now. Like I said, disk duplicators are pretty ancient in their design. So this particular one is all Centronics 50 ports, and you can see how thin the sheet metal is. But these are old school 50-pin SCSI ports, really. And you've got serial and, optional ports is probably for a USB connection. There's little posts, one of which is actually broken off for mounting, and then it's got a kind of cheap power supply. We'll get into that when we open it up, but it's interesting to say the least. So I am going to be using one of these SFF 8087 to 8088 adapters, and unfortunately they don't come with a bracket to use these in a duplicator case. So I just chopped the end off the regular PCI bracket. I'm just going to hot glue this thing in. I don't really care. It's a one-off, so I'm just going to glue it in. I was considering modeling something and 3D printing it, but for a one-off, don't need to. Although the case in general is quite nicely made, there are some cheaper aspects of it, like these punched out vents have jagged metal on them that's just been painted over, so at least it's not sharp anymore. But that's pretty cheap. But it's thin steel and it works. So on the inside you can really see just how sparse it is without space for a motherboard. It's really just optical drives and a power supply, which is pretty good for this purpose at least. This particular one comes with an 80 millimeter fan, built-in power supply, very built-in, because it's actually, the switch runs directly into the power supply. It's kind of a side effect of it being a custom power supply for disk duplicators. The power supply is a CFI group branded power supply that I can't find any information on other than, it's 220 watt, which is plenty for a bunch of drives. And it's completely custom. It's got one Molex connector for the plugged with the fan plugged into it. A floppy drive connector for power, which is very common for just duplicator controllers. They often use floppy drive power connectors. And then just 7 SATA ports. And this one actually has a little connector here for an optional fan. And there's actually a mystery wire coming out of the power supply with some electrical tape, and I traced it inside. It actually connects to an optional LED. So if you need to see that it's turned on, I would actually disconnect the LED anyway, so I don't really need it. And then there's the funky wire that comes off that's just the hard power switch on the front. I opened up the power supply. It's, you know, not great, but it's not terrible. It's pretty cheap caps and everything, but it'll work for what you need it to, which is just powering some drives. With chia farming sucking up most of the hard drive enclosures and hard drives in general, tracking down some good hard drive cages that actually have decent airflow is pretty difficult without chia, but with chia it's even worse. So the ones I've picked are these particular ones that hold 5 drives, and more importantly, they also hold a 120 millimeter fan. They don't come with them. I just installed a few, some fractal design fans that I happen to have. And what I like about these is that they're pretty much the best airflow you're going to get. Pretty much every single hot swap bay, like aftermarket one that you'd install in optical drive bays, they just have terrible airflow. Some of them have fans, some of them don't. And the ones that do have fans, they usually have underpowered fans that don't cool the drives enough. This one, you simply take a drive, attach its little rails, and then you can just pop the drive in, and there's plenty of space for airflow when you have more drives. I mean, not tons, but there's a few millimeters of space. You just need a bit of airflow over the drive, and it's very even because of the large 120 millimeter fan. You can even install 2.5-inch drives if you want using a bay adapter. So one thing I'd recommend with these ones is when you get the power splitters is to get this style that has the big looped connections, because once you've hooked that up, if you're using the kind of more standard flat ones that have the very short cables that just connect from drive to drive, they look very clean, and I do use them on my server. My server has hot swappable, front accessible bays. So these ones, you have to pull the drive out. So if you've got the very tight power connection, if a drive fails, you can't get the drive out. With these, there's enough play in the wire to kind of loop it out of the way and then pull it out. Hopefully you don't have to do it, but you know, drives always fail eventually. So, you know, you need your ability to swap them out. And in this particular case, I'm not going to have enough room to get every single drive out, probably because of the power supply location. So you're kind of trading off airflow for hot swappability. The front accessible, like trayless ones, are really good for easy replacements, which you may need if your drives are running at like 50 degrees Celsius. With this particular one, getting to the drives is a lot harder. They just have a much better airflow design, so I went with this one. And even these are pretty hard to find right now. A lot of the ones I tried to buy, they said they were out of stock and I couldn't get them, so eventually I found some seller in China who had them. And yeah, so you just disassemble the front and just install the little screws for the fan, and you got a nice cooled array of 5 hard drives. Internally, you're going to need an expander to connect all the drives. I mean, you could get away. Each one of these connectors brings over 4 drives worth of ports. So you can have 8 drives using one of these and 2 cables. If you want to have a lot of drives, you can use one of these. This is a Dell SAS expander, and I'll list the part numbers in the description because there's like 10 different part numbers they use. Basically, they're all the same from what I can tell. And this thing is a 36 port expander. So you can have one connection in here and then hook up 32 drives. So you can actually get SFF 8088 2 SATA cables. So you can just run this external port directly into a drive, or 4 drives. So you can use these for internal ports. I believe this also supports dual links to the card. So you can double them up. I'm not sure if you get increased speed or if it's just for redundancy, but either way. Yeah, so the only problem with these things is they are a weird custom form factor. They're not a PCI Express card, and they need a power cable, which you can't really get. I'll try to track down the forum post again, but there's a forum post where some people reverse engineered the pinout on this, and it's just 2 grounds, 5 volt and 12 volt, and you can simply make a cable using an old SATA or Molex cable, and then a CPU power connector, the 12 volt power connector. Just make sure you test fit it first before cutting up the wire, because the 8-pin version, only half of it works. You can't use both. You can't make 2 cables out of one 8-pin CPU power connector. You can only use one half of it. So just be aware of that when you're making the cable. And it's pretty, I just put this together a little bit with a soldering iron, no problem. And then you get a whole bunch of drives. So then you can use an 8087 cable to 4 SATA ports on each one, however many you need. In this case, it can't hold that many drives. Oh, as a side note, there's actually mounting screws on the bottom of the duplicator case for an extra bare drive, because duplicators often have the option of having a hard drive to store disk images. So you get one extra drive. So if you want one without great airflow, you can stick a cool running drive down at the bottom too. You can get an 8088 to 8087 cable, which is a little odd because these are meant for external ports. With this, you can run the external connector right into this, so that you have more of these available for drives if you're pushing a lot of drives. So you can make use of these ports for both connection to the main computer or RAID controller, and also as for SATA ports or SAS ports. So once I'm going to run an internal connection to this, then this will run with an 8088 cable to my NAS and plug into the back. Fun fact, when I got this, I noticed there was a little chip on a ceramic capacitor, and when I made the cable and plugged in the power, the capacitor exploded, and it shorted right across it. And yeah, it didn't look like it was too badly damaged. I just happened to notice the little chip in it. But yeah, it was a complete dead short, and luckily that cap took all of the damage, and I just took the cap off, cleared the short. I just soldered whatever kind of large cap I had, and yeah, works fine. So yeah, this just has an LSI expander chip on it, and some memory and some flash. As for actual connections to your computer, the options are pretty varied. They're usually not too bad in terms of price to get the external versions of RAID cards or HBA cards that are basically just dumb disk controllers. This particular one is the LSI 9216E, which gives you 4 of those 8088 ports, so a total of 16 drives. And although not too long ago these things were 20 bucks, they've kind of skyrocketed in price to like around 100. So good luck getting one at a good price, unfortunately. The good news is if you're using an expander, you don't actually need all 4 ports unless you're hooking up a lot of them, a lot of external cases. So what you can do is you can get the very rarely thought of 4i 4e version that has a single port internally and a single port externally. So you can just plug in your external drive, and you can plug in another expander internally and hook up as many drives, and you can run it all off one card, which is really good if you're on limited PCI slots as well. Right now, these things are 16 bucks. I'm sure the price will go up once people start to realize how these things are pretty good deals if you can get a cheap expander. And since most expanders are hundreds of dollars now, especially these 6 gigabit versions, these things are 40 bucks right now. You just need to spend a little bit of money, like a few bucks, and buy a couple sacrificial cables, and you get all the ports you'd ever want for 40 bucks. And I'm sure they're going to skyrocket in price. And I'm sure by the time I release this video, I'm sure they'll be way more expensive. I already bought a couple. So the advantage of these is that you can just use a single card, and you can hook up a whack ton of drives actually up to like 64 drives off this one card. And since hard drives use very little bandwidth, even though they're splitting the bandwidth, it's not really that bad. I mean, very rarely would you be accessing all 32 drives that you've plugged into it. So you do get decent speed out of them, unless you're using all SSDs, which I wouldn't really recommend. One side note is that all three of these cards absolutely need active cooling. It doesn't matter if you're in a server case and it's got airflow going over it, that's fine, but you need to have active cooling on these things. So if you're just putting it in a regular case, strap a 40mm fan onto it, and that's good enough. But they definitely need cooling. This thing gets very hot, actually. While these are cheap, and while these are cheap, this is a really good combo for a lot of drives. For the price of a single 16-port card, actually less than the price of a single 16-port card. Often 16-port internal cards are easily $200 to $300 for a legit one, whereas this, 16 bucks plus 80 for two of these, and you have way more drives, and you can install them in two separate units, like an external case and an internal case. It's really a good deal right now, at least until everyone figures out what you can do with them. Okay, it's actually been quite a while since I did the original video. I hooked up all the wiring, and as you can see, it's a nightmare inside this thing. Despite all the cable clutter, it actually has really good cooling. None of the drives, it's got about 10 drives in it. Well, actually 11, because I put in a single unit bay at the top, which unfortunately doesn't have a fan, so I just put a low power drive in there. The temperatures have been great, all under 40 degrees, which is what I want. And despite the airflow restrictions, it's pretty good. These cages really are great for cooling on drives. I mean, I think they're just the best design for cooling, the worst design for replacing drives, but the best design for cooling. What I ended up doing was just 3D printing some spacers so that I could just keep the board away from the metal panel, and I just screwed through them. So it's holding it well. You want to watch out that it doesn't contact the case, since it could short. Other than that, little spacers work just fine. I'm probably going to use double-sided tape for some future stuff with these expander boards, but the screws work. Naturally, since that worked out so well, I figured, why not get a bigger one? So this one has 12 bays and was pretty cheap on eBay. Actually, it was pretty much the same cost as the much smaller version. I have extras of those modules that hold 5 drives with a fan, so I figured why not throw 4 of them into one of these, because I got a Rosewill case that came with 3 of them, and I'm not going to be using them in that case, and I'd rather just stick them in here and just have a lot more capacity. So I'm going to throw a whole bunch of drives into this. I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to put an expander in here. I don't know if I will keep using the little one. Probably not, unless I come into a whole bunch of really cheap drives. This one is a pretty old disk duplicator made by Microboards, and it's a 1 to 10 duplicator. It's all parallel ATA drives and, ancient. So I'm going to rip everything out, get rid of all these drives, because I definitely don't need those, and start swapping them out for these cages. This uses another kind of custom power supply used for these sort of things. It just has a whole bunch of Molex connectors. I'm going to open it up, see if it's any good. I do have a regular PC power supply to use if that's no good. It's got a couple loud fans that are also powered by Molex connectors. I'm going to ditch those. It came with a hard drive. Not going to use that. It's an ancient 137 gig one. And this one uses this like fancy control board with all these IDE cables. There's a module at the top with a display in the user interface. There's nothing else. This is where they mounted the hard drive, but all the control seems to be on this single board, which I'll take out once I get all these drives out. For those who are interested, this is the mount that came with the Duplicator controller. It's actually a pretty nice steel mount, but unfortunately it took up too much space inside the unit, so I couldn't use it. I would have liked to have been able to repurpose that for something, but this is the controller. Whole bunch of IDE connectors. This looks like a SCSI connector. I'm not sure what they're using that for. LCD connector. They're using a Xilinx Spartan as a main controller. It's a FPGA. Bunch of power supply stuff, some dip switches, few Xilinx CPLDs, and a whole bunch of these are probably like bus terminators or something. Tons of resistors. Omni revision 1.02. And yeah, looks like there's some optional connectors for different designs, and it runs off a little floppy drive power connector. So this is going to be 12 volt and 5 volt, and they're probably making 3.3 or something for the FPGAs. And there's a little buzzer on it too, I guess, for when you're done burning your disks. But yeah, these are all pretty much the same. I've taken a look at other ones before, and they're pretty much you know, an FPGA or a CPLD that's just spewing out data from the master drive. This one does support hard drives, so you can also have it spewing it from image files. Okay, that took a lot more time and effort than I was expecting. The case itself has a front bezel that's slightly too small to hold regular drive holders. So when I took out the optical drives, I couldn't actually fit those drive holders in. So I had to Dremel along the side of the plastic. That took forever and made a lot of noise. Something that's really common with these cases is that because they're optical drives, they have these little ledges that stick in so that the optical drives just slide in and they're level while you screw them in. They're really annoying because they get in the way of multi-bay devices because they need to extend past them. It's not a problem in the Copy Stars case because it's newer and made out of thinner metal, so you can bend it. These were a pain. I was bashing them with hammers. I was trying to pry them down. I eventually settled on a technique with big pliers to get it started and then pressing them down with a slot screwdriver to move every single one of these on both sides, which took a long time. Once I finished all that and put in the drive cages, it turns out the cages that come with the Rosewell case aren't tapped. So I put them in and I can't screw any M3 screws into them. And yeah, so I had to go tap them. And of course the tap I had was utter garbage. So I got like these terrible taps done and screws are just like falling out left and right. So yeah, at some point I'll fix those. They seem to be holding enough. This can be jank. It doesn't need to be super fancy. This is all for just bulk storage for Chia. So, and it's basically made out of stuff that I have already, with the exception of the case. So, obviously, if you're trying to make money off something, or, you know, in my case, just doing it as a goofy hobby, you want to minimize the costs, or at least the costs of things that you can't use for other stuff. So like obviously the Fractal Design power supply, it's a 560 watt. That can go into something else. All the SAS stuff can go into something else. Once you get all the cables in there, it's kind of a nightmare. Internally, it's just a whole bunch of cables. I've tried to keep them from getting bunched up and blocking too much of the airflow. I put covers on all the fans so that cables don't bump into them. I have the SAS expander just stuck to the side panel. Yeah, it's just a big mess of cables. I also jammed in a tray from a Fractal Design Node 804 case so I could put in 4 more drives. It's right in front of the fan, so it'll get good airflow. Altogether, there are 23 drives installed with space for 3 more. Plus, I have 2 more free SATA cables, so I could actually put like a couple drives just sitting at the bottom, most likely 2.5-inch drives. In retrospect, it went together pretty easily aside from those 2 annoying problems, but in retrospect, I think I'd rather have just bought another Rosewell L4500U. They come with 15 drive sleds. They actually come with these units. If you're just using it as a JBOD, where you're not putting in a computer and you're just using it essentially as a giant external SAS box, you have all that space for the motherboard that you can use. So you can just stick a bunch of these trays in there and just have tons of space in it. So, and yeah, in retrospect, I should have just done that. DVD Duplicator does have its advantages in that I am limited to about 15U. So when I switch all my stuff over to rack mount, I won't really have space for another 4U. So yeah, kind of stuck with the vertical method of the DVD Duplicator. Oh, and as a little final note, you do need a little jumper to keep the power going on the power supplies that you're using, unless you're using the internal one that came with it, because they're generally linked up to a power switch. Since I put in a regular ATX, you need this, and you can just control power with the switch on the back.